30 years ago, if someone had stood on Wall Street and announced that China would become the United States' #1 economic rival, they would have received a fair amount of ridicule. How could a country synonymous with copycats, cheap goods, and cheap labor challenge America's high-tech manufacturing? But today, the Made in China label is no longer found on flea market clothes or cheap electronics. It's on smart electric vehicles, high-tech semiconductors, and even AI robots that can converse in English more fluently than native Brooklynites. According to research from the Belfer Center, Harvard University, China has transformed from a low-cost manufacturing base in the 1990s to a serious competitor in advanced industries such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, biotechnology, and green energy. We are no longer talking about a far-fetched hypothesis. The economic race between the two superpowers is underway, fiercer, more comprehensive, and quieter than any shooting war. The question now is no longer, will America continue to lead? But in this increasingly close technological and economic race between the US and China, what is America losing and at what cost? Welcome back to Economy Roast. Today's video will help you get a satisfactory answer.
Over the past 2 decades, while millions of containers bearing the words "Made in China" have been arriving at the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and New York, on the other side of the country, in industrial towns that were once the pride of America, production lines have been silent, factories have been shuttered, and millions of jobs have been gone without a return date. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute, from 2001 alone, the year China officially joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, to 2023, the United States has lost more than 3.7 million jobs due to the trade deficit with China. More than 75% of these were in the manufacturing sector, especially in states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, once symbols of American industrial power. MIT economics professor David Autor, along with his colleagues Dorn and Hansen, described this phenomenon as a China shock, a systemic shock, sudden, widespread, and with long-lasting consequences. Research published in the American Economic Review in 2016 shows that areas that are directly exposed to competition from Chinese imports, that area sees a sharp decline in employment, lower incomes, and almost no recovery potential. In an interview titled Q&A, David Autor on the lingering aftershocks of the China shock not only caused job losses but also left local communities unable to recover, with unemployment and dependency on subsidies becoming more severe. Places that suffered the trade shock from China did not recover. They were stuck. For example, Youngstown, Ohio, once the nation's steel capital, is now a ghost town, with an unemployment rate of more than 12%, nearly double the national average. In Flint, Michigan, home to General Motors, which once produced hundreds of thousands of cars a year, only a handful of small machine shops are still operating, while young people are leaving their hometown to find a better life elsewhere. Although manufacturing cities in the United States have recovered from the shock of surging imports from China that began 25 years ago, the workers who lost their jobs have not really benefited. They have been unable to find new jobs, have not been promoted, and have gradually lost their sense of professional identity. From mechanics to manufacturing engineers to ride-sharing drivers or coffee servers, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. The consequences are not limited to the economy. Studies show that rates of depression, opioid addiction have increased sharply in areas affected by the China shock. Expert David Autor warns this is not just a trade crisis, but a crisis of trust, of community cohesion, and a direct blow to the American middle class, the force that once created the dream called American Dream. Since the beginning of the year, the United States and China have continuously taken actions to increase tariffs and retaliate against each other. The conflict was sparked by US President Donald Trump, who, at its peak, declared a 145% tariff increase on Chinese goods in April 2025. China then responded by announcing a 125% tariff on American products. The two sides later negotiated and reached a framework agreement in June. If this agreement is officially signed, it will allow the US to impose a 55% tariff on Chinese goods, while China will impose a 10% tariff on imports from the US. The Chinese products affected by US tariffs include electronics, electric vehicles, EV batteries, strategic materials, rare earths, consumer goods, clothing, toys, and medical equipment. In retaliation, China has imposed tariffs on American agricultural products, soybeans, meat, automobiles, liquefied natural gas, LNG, industrial machinery, and luxury goods such as wine and cosmetics. It seemed that tariffs would be a lever for the US to revive its manufacturing industry, but the reality is much harsher. A report by the US Congressional Budget Office, CBO, released in mid-2025 showed that US real GDP decreased by 0.5% to 1%, depending on the prolonged scenario of the tariff war. Household incomes fell by an average of 1.4% due to rising import prices and rising living costs. In a speech by Fed Chairman Jerome Powell to Reuters, published on June 24, 2025, Mr. Powell warned that the new US tariffs on China could create persistent inflationary pressures, thereby complicating the Federal Reserve's task of stabilizing prices. He emphasized that if these tariffs continue or escalate, we will be forced to take their inflationary impact more seriously in conducting monetary policy. And worse, jobs are not coming back to the US. Companies are not investing in factories in Detroit or Ohio. They are shifting their supply chains to geopolitically safer destinations. Vietnam, India, Mexico. Low costs, less tax risk, and proximity to Asian supply chains, these are the ideal choices in times of uncertainty. The reality is, US companies no longer need America to manufacture. Apple expands its production lines in India. Nike increases production in Vietnam. General Electric assembles medical equipment in Mexico. They are looking for profits, not responsibilities to US workers. The higher tariff is not the lifeline it was hoped for. It is a double-edged sword. It makes US goods more expensive in China, but it does not bring any real benefits to local workers. Factory towns remain deserted. The Midwest's fields are still unsold, and the dream of reviving domestic manufacturing remains just an election promise. Why are Chinese goods often cheap, even very cheap compared to goods from other countries? When you buy a pair of $19 sneakers at Walmart or a cheap Lenovo laptop at Best Buy, have you ever wondered, why are Chinese goods so cheap? The answer lies not only in labor costs, it is the total support mechanism of a planned industrialization state. And the main reasons may be: Reason 1. Low labor costs. China has a labor force of nearly 800 million people, the largest in the world. In many Western provinces, such as Guizhou or Gansu, the average wage is only 1/6 of the minimum wage in the US. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, the average wage for Chinese workers in 2023 is about $8,280 per year, while in the US it is $58,260 per year. A huge difference in cost. Reason 2, huge scale of production, cost accumulation advantage. China does not produce one thing, it produces everything, and produces them within a radius of tens of kilometers. Industrial clusters such as Shenzhen electronics, Guangzhou textiles, Ningbo mechanics can collect everything from screws, circuit boards, to packaging, transportation, all domestically within a day. When the scale exceeds a certain threshold, the cost per unit of product will decrease sharply, called economies of scale. Reason 3, proactive state intervention, unlimited support. Chinese businesses have access to low-interest credit, are given priority by the state for land, and even subsidize electricity, water, and transportation. According to the WTO's 2021 report, China's total industrial subsidies are estimated at more than $248 billion per year, the most in the world, most 3 times the level of the entire EU combined. This is not free competition, but competition based on state muscle. But cheap does not mean profitable. From 2001, when China joined the WTO, to 2018, the US lost more than 3.4 million jobs due to the trade deficit with China, mostly in the following industries: textiles, electronics, metal and machinery manufacturing. These are not just dry numbers, these are the workers who assembled chips in Illinois, welded steel frames in Pennsylvania, and wove fabrics in North Carolina. They didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their identity as workers, and they lost the American middle-class dream. The low prices of Chinese goods are the result of a systematic and aggressive economic strategy. But the price America has paid is the quiet disintegration of its own industry. China imposed an 84% tariff on certain US goods on April 9, 2025. as part of its retaliatory measures against U.S. tariffs. The tariff remained in effect for nearly 5 weeks before the two sides reached an agreement to scale back the duties. Several American companies were affected. Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland, two of the largest U.S. agricultural conglomerates, reported a sharp decline in soybean orders from China in April 2025. China had long been the largest buyer of American agricultural exports, particularly soybeans. At its peak, the U.S. exported up to 30 million tons of soybeans annually, primarily from states like Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska. The impact extended beyond agriculture. ExxonMobil reported delays and cancellations in liquefied natural gas (LNG) shipments due to higher Chinese tariffs, as Beijing shifted purchases to suppliers in Qatar and Russia. Tesla and Ford also noted a temporary drop in U.S. vehicle sales in China, citing higher import taxes and a shift in consumer sentiment away from American goods. John Deere, a leading manufacturer of agricultural machinery, saw a sharp decline in shipments to China and was described by U.S. media as a direct casualty of the 84% tariff. At this point, the so-called domino effect is no longer an economic theory. When farmers lose income, they cut spending. When factories close, towns lose jobs. When businesses just leave the market, the entire supply chain breaks down. If tariffs are the obvious front, then behind them is a more silent but dangerous battle, the supply chain war. Immediately after the US imposed tariffs, China not only retaliated with 84%, but also launched a soft weapon, but also a heavyweight, cutting off rare earth exports and indispensable materials for electric vehicles, semiconductor chips, AI, and even defense. China currently controls over 90% of the global rare earth refining supply chain. If it tightens this supply, major US tech companies like Tesla, Apple, and Intel will immediately find themselves at a disadvantage. Rare earth magnets, a core component in electric motors and robotics, would become scarce. That is why in the June 2025 framework agreement to ease tensions between the US and China, both sides included immediate provisions on rare earths, with China agreeing to expedite the issuance of export permits for rare earth elements and related materials. Not only rare earths, China also controls most of the raw materials and components of the global industrial chain. Lithium batteries. China produces up to 92% of graphite anodes, the main ingredient in electric vehicle batteries. Pharmaceuticals. The US depends on up to 80% of pharmaceutical raw materials, APIs, from China and India. Electronic components. Apple, Qualcomm, Nvidia, all have dozens of suppliers located in China. The economic war between the US and China did not start with tariffs, and certainly it will not end with numbers. Many prestigious organizations and international press have said that since China joined the WTO in 2001, the US has gone through 3 stages of defense, counterattack, reconstruction. Each stage reflects a strategic choice and a painful lesson. Defense stage, 2001, China joins the WTO. According to Foreign Affairs, China joined the WTO on December 11, 2001. Marking a turning point in its strategy of opening up and integrating into the global economy. Cambridge University Press and the University of Illinois Law Review provide an in-depth analysis of how the United States under Clinton and Bush used the WTO to push China to reform its markets and comply with international rules. The counterattack phase, 2016, Trump launches tariff war. Starting in 2017, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, triggering a series of tariffs and a Section 301 investigation against China's intellectual property practices. Although officially a trade war, many analysts believe this is the beginning of a protracted economic war to counter China's state-owned economy. Reconstruction phase, after 2020, shifting to a policy of decoupling and multilateralization. After 2020, under both the Trump and Biden administrations, the US continues to maintain tariffs and apply technology control measures such as restricting chips, ZTE, Huawei, etc., while promoting friendshoring, alternative supply chains outside of China. Analyses from Australia and the US say that this policy marks a shift from a demand-driven to a confrontational structure, aiming to rebuild the supply chain and reduce dependence on China. However, the implementation process is still slower than expected. 2025 marks the beginning of a strategy to restructure the entire supply chain with the goal of reducing dependence on China. So it can be said that the US-China confrontation has never been officially declared war. There are no tanks, no warships, just taxes, supply chains, technology, and market share. But the price the US might pay is real. Agriculture, hurt by losing key export markets. Manufacturing industry, unable to recover domestic production, losing more orders. Technology pushed out of key supply chains, facing the risk of falling behind. China's pursuing a grand strategy to replace the US's global leadership role, first at the regional level, then globally. While Beijing makes its moves over 10-20 years, Washington is still struggling with 4-year election cycles and internal disagreements. This is not just an economic war, but a geostrategic battle of wits. Whoever controls the future of supply chains, clean energy, semiconductors, and data will control the balance of global power in the 21st century. And this auction for status, influence, and the dream of technology is inevitable. In short, America cannot return to the old world where it led unchallenged. But America still has the opportunity to shape a new order if it dares to look at the truth, invest in the future, and accept that power is not about where you have been, it is about how much you are willing to change to stay there. What do you think about all that we have just discussed? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel to follow other useful analysis videos. Now goodbye and see you again.